Very important example of the Hegelian synthesis playing out in the history of ideas, meaning this idea of a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis playing out in the history of ideas, is the Ash'ari synthesis between reason and revelation, or the Ash'ari middle ground between reason and revelation. This is within the context of the early Islamic theological tradition and its development. In the early Islamic tradition, especially within the Sunni tradition, there were two groups which fiercely debated and competed over the role of reason and revelation in theology. On one hand, you had the Mu'tazila school. The Mu'tazila were essentially ultra-rationalists. They saw reason as the ultimate tool to understand the divine, and that revelation could not contradict reason, therefore it should be interpreted through an intellectual lens. They weren't necessarily saying that the Quran was inferior to reason, but they kind of put it on an equal footing, so that reason was fundamentally on the same level as, let's say, the Quran. And the Sunnah, the prophetic traditions, should be approached through a very intellectual and somewhat skeptical lens. This was the approach of the Mu'tazila. It's not necessarily correct to say that they were liberal minded or they were somehow liberals or free thinkers, not at least in the sense that we would use those words. Because, for example, they had a history of persecuting their opponents. You can see this in the Inquisition of somebody like Ahmed ibn Hanbal at the hands of the Mu'tazila. Yeah, for all intents and purposes, they were ultra-rationalists in their own way. They were very heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, especially those Greek philosophical works that had been translated from their languages into Arabic during the major translation movements that took place during the early Abbasid Caliphate. This sect, of course, like I mentioned, prioritized reason, and this led to a counter-reaction in the formation of the Ahlul Hadith school, also commonly known as the Athari school or the Hanbali school. Now, this school was scripture-centric, whereas one put reason over revelation, the other sought to put revelation as the supreme head of all things. In other words, revelation dictated how we understood the divine. Reason was very limited in its scope. It was not to decide on final matters of divinity, but rather we were to return to revelation to understand those issues, to understand the attributes of God, to understand the nature of free will and predestination. The Atharis or the Ahlul Hadith school said that scripture had the last say. They tended to critique the use of things like philosophy or rational theology, aka Kalam theology within the Muslim world, as rationalistic tools that tended to go against the orthodox teachings of the Islamic faith as expounded upon by God in the Quran and by the Prophet Muhammad in his Sunnah teachings. Of course, there's a lot of simplification that I'm doing here just to water it down and explain it in simple terms. But the Ash'ari school essentially kind of provided a synthesis between these two approaches, or they tried to find a kind of middle ground where revelation was prioritized, or revelation was put at the forefront of theology, and in order to understand theology you had to go back to scripture. However, in theory, scripture could not contradict reason. In other words, whatever revelation came with, reason would confirm. And so whilst reason was below revelation in terms of status and deciding matters of theology, it supported and further solidified what revelation had come with. In other words, although revelation was the most prioritized and the foremost when it came to understanding matters of theology, you couldn't just throw reason out to the side and get rid of it completely. When you look at the founder of the school, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the great theologian, he, of course, was very much influenced by his upbringing and his background. And his background especially informs us of why he came to the conclusions he came to, and especially why, based within his context and the social conditions of the time, he came up with his theological ideas. His father was supposedly an Orthodox Sunni man who would listen to hadith gatherings, who would attend hadith gatherings, but he passed away, and his mother ended up marrying someone very famous within the Mu'tazila circle, Al-Jubba'i. Al-Jubba'i was one of the most foremost Mu'tazila theologians. He was one of the most important theologians within the Mu'tazila sect. And so Al-Jubba'i essentially became a foster father, stepfather, but also the mentor and the guardian of Al-Ash'ari. And so, even though his father may have been an Orthodox Sunni, Al-Ash'ari himself grew up in a Mu'tazila environment. And Al-Ash'ari, supposedly, at least historically, as per the reports that have come from his time, that Al-Ash'ari became one of the foremost scholars of the Mu'tazila. Al-Ash'ari was one of the leading experts of Mu'tazili theology, and he used to defend Mu'tazili theology. The details of Al-Ash'ari's life have been mentioned by many academics, such as Dr. Fawqiyya Hussein in her edited critical edition of Ash'ari's work Al-Ibana. You should go read it if you can in the original Arabic. It's an excellent academic work that very well summarizes the thoughts of Al-Ash'ari, his biography, and also goes into great detail about his work Al-Ibana itself, which is a point of much controversy, especially within certain polemical circles. Nevertheless, Al-Ash'ari eventually, at one point, he starts to question the Mu'tazili creed, and he starts to think of the things, the aspects of the creed of the Mu'tazila that just don't seem to add up to him, at least. And so he eventually recants his position as a Mu'tazili, and at first, there seems to be a bit of ambiguity regarding Ash'ari's development, or there seems to be a bit of there's something strange about Al-Ash'ari's development, and it's not so clear what exactly was his trajectory. It seems for a while that he was influenced very heavily by the Hanbali school, or at the least he was trying to cater towards the Hanbali school at a certain point. And this is why his work, such as Al-Ibana, his famous, the exposition, the exposition, came out, and essentially he was kind of trying to appease the Hanbalis. But eventually he ended up adopting the methodology, the theological kalam methodology of Ibn Kullab. And Ibn Kullab was essentially a precursor to the established traditionalist kalam theologians within the normative Sunni tradition, aka the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Ibn Kullab and his contemporaries were essentially precursors to that. Al-Ash'ari adopts that, he adopts many of Ibn Kullab's ideas, and he expounds and develops upon them, and he founds the Ash'ari school. Like I mentioned, the Ash'ari school is essentially a kind of synthesis or a kind of middle ground between the reason-centric approach of the Mu'tazila and the scripture-centric approach of the Atharis. You could possibly argue that the Ash'aris are slightly more towards the scripture-centric approach. However, there are important details of theology in which they very heavily disagree with the Atharis, and that have led to a lot of conflict and very severe disagreement. And you see this playing out later on, for example, with somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah, where he very heavily criticizes the Ash'aris from his Hanbali standpoint. But nevertheless, the Ash'aris represent this middle ground. And so whilst they prioritize revelation, they also acknowledge and use reason as an important tool to understand theology. And hence, it actually ends up becoming a kind of synthesis where the conflict, the disagreement, the dispute between these two theological schools led to the synthesis of reason and revelation that carried forward and was carried on to the normative Islamic Sunni tradition, especially for most of its history. And you see later on, for example, with the Ottomans, and you see most of Islamic history, and indeed a vast majority of Islamic scholarship, and some of the most important Islamic scholars of all time have indeed come from an Ash'ari background.